We are just about wrapped up with the 4.8 versus 8.1 shootout that we're in the middle of. And today, if everything goes right, we are actually going to get the 4.8 LR4 back under the hood of this Silverado. We just got a few things to wrap up with the Valvetrain. I'm going to swap out the torque converters. I have a much higher stall speed converter. I do have a Corvette servo for the transmission, and I think I've got just enough space to swap that out. We'll get the motor in, and then we'll start buttoning things up. We definitely won't get to a first startup today because I've got to build a whole custom exhaust and a few other odds and ends, but at least if we get the motor back under the hood, oh, that's a pretty significant milestone. But first, we got to take care of some Valvetrain stuff. Just to kind of get you caught up to speed in terms of where we're at with this build. Basically, I pulled it out of the truck because it was really, really leaky. I completely disassembled it. I did leave the crank in, but all the pistons and rods came out. We gapped the rings just to make sure that we have plenty of clearance because eventually this engine is going to get boosted. I don't know which route we're going. I may turbocharge it. I may supercharge it. There's tons of great options for these trucks. You could put a centrifugal blower on, like a Pro Charger, a root style blower like an LSA, or just the traditional turbo because everybody turbos these trucks. Either route, in my opinion, is a great option. I already have a turbo truck, so I'll probably go with a supercharger, but we'll see. Either way, this engine is prepared to receive whatever boost we decide to throw at it. We got a different cam in there, brand new oil pump, all new gaskets, everything got cleaned up, and we have new valve springs in there. So basically, the icing on the cake today, we've got to do some upgrades to the stock rocker arms. From the factory, this is kind of what they look like right here. You have a rocker arm, I don't know what that is, cast something or other, and this is what it pivots on. And as you can see, after a certain amount of rotation, it kind of comes up against a stop like that. I don't know if the cam that we've installed, it's got, let's see, we're at like 575, 580 lift, somewhere in there. I don't know if that would actually cause interference at that lift level, but supposedly these stock Trunnions, I think they're called, they're just not strong as some of the better solutions on the aftermarket. So I went to Summit and I picked up a BTR Trunnion upgrade kit. I think that's what they call it. It's like 125 bucks, totally not a budget killer. And basically what you get is everything that you see here for all 16 rockers. You get a new center pivot and there is no stop. So this can rotate a full 360 degrees without binding up. You've got the little snap rings that kind of go on the outside to hold it all in place. And you can't see the roller bearings, but this is kind of what you get, a whole bunch of these little roller bearings. So I got one half of the engine completely swapped out and I got the other half to still clean up, and I'll show you the process of swapping those over. It's pretty simple, and I did buy a special tool for this, although you do not need it. This just makes your life a little simpler. That's the part number from Comp, and this part of the kit is, let's see, there's that and this. They work together. Basically, this is what you use to press out the stock parts. You can see there's the little grooves in there. That is just kind of where the rocker arm sits into place, sort of like that. And this actually has a magnet on the back, which makes it, oh, dropping stuff. But the magnet actually goes on one side of your vise and just kind of holds it there. And this little special cup shape, basically this kind of indexes right on there, and that allows you to push the center shaft out. And like I said, you don't have to have these tools, but that just makes it a little bit easier to line everything up. And then when you put it back together, you just got these big washers here. They're the right thickness. They just kind of go over the end before we put the snap ring on. But like I said, I'll show you that whole process. It's very simple. I'll get the rest of the Valvetrain cleaned up. We'll put it in. We'll check the, not valve lash, because this uses a, it kind of compresses the lifter a little bit, but I'll show you how to check that to make sure you're in the right zone. We'll get the valve covers cleaned up, put back on, swap the converter out, and then we'll get the motor back in the truck. In order to check preload on the lifter, basically what I do is I'll kind of slowly tighten the bolt until we have no play. There's quite a bit of play there, so I'll go a little bit more. Just kind of wiggle it. The other thing you can do is kind of twist the push rod, but on these LS's, there's just not a lot of space up in there. Still a little bit of play, a little bit less, tiny bit. Okay, so right there, I'm considering that 0 lash. Now we'll just count the turns from here. So kind of line the wrench up. That's a good starting point. So there's a quarter turn, half turn, 3/4, 1 full turn. Kind of starts to get tight. So there's about 1 turn of preload on this valve right here. All right, so I got all the Valvetrain in, and we should have basically a somewhat budget but rock solid Valvetrain that should help this motor spin to, I don't know, 6,500, 6,700 RPM, maybe somewhere in there. The 4.8, it could probably spin all the way up to 7. I don't know if we're going to be still making power up that high. We'll find out when we get to the dyno, which hopefully should be in just another couple of short weeks, because we still got to get everything put back together, built the exhaust, tuned, and whatnot. But we're cranking every day. I did want to mention a few things on the Valvetrain. If you do the BTR roller trunnion, make sure the little bearings, you put the letters on the outside. They were very adamant about that. They mentioned it several times in the instructions. And then if you're OCD like me, I just made sure that the little snap ring, every single one of them was facing up, because that just kind of makes me happy. In terms of checking lifter preload, I have right about 90 thousandths of preload, and depending on where you get your information from, I did a bunch of reading. It looks like the accepted range for an LS7 style lifter, which is what we are running in this engine, the accepted range is somewhere between like 60 to 120 thousandths, which is a pretty good range. But the reason I know we're right about 90 is because I counted the turns, but I also took a bolt. This is the same exact thread that goes into the cylinder head for the rockers, and I measured exactly 1 turn of the threads, which is kind of hard to show with the camera right there, but 1 turn of the threads is 60 thousandths of an inch, so a turn and a half is 90. So about 90 thousandths preload, and basically you just want to have it so the push rod is not loose, but you also don't want the push rod to bottom all the way out down in the lifter, because there's a little like plunger in there, and it uses hydraulic pressure from the engine oil to kind of float somewhere in the middle. One way I just kind of verify that everything looks right, call it a sanity check, is the very first time I rotate the engine over after tightening the valves down, just kind of watch the tips of the valve. So I crank it over until we get maximum lift, and then just stop. And you should watch that valve kind of rises up a little bit as it compresses that plunger down in the lifter, because there's no oil pressure. So as long as you see that, to me, that's just kind of a sanity check. That means everything should be somewhat in the right operating area. But of course, you do want to have some sort of a method. You know, what I'm doing here, counting the turns, isn't necessarily the most scientific method. You know, you could get, or you probably should get, an adjustable push rod, you know, measure it exactly with a long caliper, and then add however much preload you want to that, because this is a non-adjustable Valvetrain. Like the big block that we're going to be doing, that will have the poly locks up here on top, so you can adjust the height of the rocker, but once again, that will also actually adjust where the tip of the valve kind of wipes across the, the tip of the rocker wipes across the valve. But with a non-adjustable Valvetrain like these LSs have, you have to just make sure you have the correct length push rod. And things that will affect it, I'm not sure if we covered this, different thickness of head gasket, different cam, different lifters. What will not affect it is your valve springs, because as long as you have the original valve, your rocker is going to still contact in the same exact spot. And as long as you have the original rocker bodies and the little rocker pivot thing, whatever you want to call that long bar, once again, those things will not affect push rod length. But camshaft, head gasket thickness, and lifters. So anyway, we're ready to move on, and just like one more thing to swap out before we get the motor in the truck. I did come out here last night, and I actually tidied up the engine bay a little bit, but I'm like really frustrated with how it came out. I don't normally paint stuff, and I kind of at this point wish that I hadn't. I tried something that I had never used before in this form. I tried a product from, where did it go? Right here. I tried this stuff, and it's supposed to be a pretty good paint. They claim you can paint right over rust, blah, blah, blah. And O'Reilly's only had flat black and gloss black, which to me, I don't really like those options. I prefer a semi-gloss black, but I grabbed flat. And it might be a good product. I've actually used it before brushing it out of a can, but in the aerosol form, it just like, it was not happening for me. One can like was completely clogged up straight out of the box. Like I opened it and it would not spray a single bit of paint. And the other one actually had a different style of nozzle on it. And when I was spraying it, it would leak so badly, like it was just dripping straight down on the floor, made a huge mess. So I got most of it done with the one can, and then I had another can of semi-gloss black, a different type of chassis paint. I kind of touched it up. So it looks a little splotchy. So at this point, I'm like, man, I'm embarrassed to even show you guys, but here's kind of how it looks after going through all that effort to paint everything up. And maybe it looks better on camera, I don't know. I am glad at least we kind of covered some of that bare metal rusted stuff. I much would have preferred a semi-gloss black, but I don't know, it's kind of painted, I guess. And then when I get the motor in, I really only wanted to paint these areas that you could, that you couldn't get to with the engine in, but like the outsides of the frame, I didn't touch those at all. But once I do rebuild the suspension, I'll get a better style of paint, and I'll paint all the other accessible areas. I'm going to be dropping the diff to do an all-wheel drive conversion, and then we'll have the bed off, doing some suspension stuff in the future. So basically, as I kind of go through the progression of the build, I'll be able to access different parts of the frame to paint it with a little bit better paint. And at least now we have something that's kind of covering up those areas. I guess it doesn't look bad, and it kind of looks better than before, but I was just really, really frustrated with that kind of paint because it made a huge mess. But I guess the important thing is it's covered, and hopefully if it is more durable than some other types of paint, maybe it was worth it. I don't know. So we've got the engine put back together. I threw the motor mounts on. I've got the valve covers ready to go. I did put a new PCV valve in this guy over here. I think the later model ones, it's built in, but this is a replaceable PCV, so that's new. The only thing I've got to do is swap torque converters, so we'll get to that right now, and we'll lift the engine up and throw it back home. As I'm getting this 4.8 ready to go back into the Silverado, I just can't help but thinking I probably ought to be putting an 8.1 in this instead, because think about it. Turbocharged, big block with all-wheel drive, I think that would be one heck of a combination. But anyway, we're gonna give this little 4.8 a shot and see what we can do with it, and it is ready to go back in the truck. I've got it on the ground here just because it's a little bit easier to tighten up the flex plate. I do have, it's the stock flex plate, but with ARP hardware, just kind of a little bit of extra insurance there, I guess. I've got the motor mounts on. I have the AC bracket right there, but of course the AC pump is still in the truck because I didn't breach any of the air conditioning system, so it still charged all the gases in there. And this is what she looks like, guys. This is all cleaned up. Looks way, way better than it did when we pulled this thing out, and now we've got a bunch of go fast goodies on the inside, and it is ready to accept just about any amount of boost that we're going to throw at it. My balancer bolt, I didn't put that in yet because I have just ordered one of those little special flywheel holding tools, and I can actually torque that down with the engine still in the truck. But that's really the last main fastener kind of on the bottom end. This should go in pretty easy because we don't have manifolds on. We had the exhaust manifolds attached when we pulled it out, which they still will fit, but it's a little bit tight. Let's see, torque converter. This is a Summit Pro LS. I think it's the highest stall that they offered for a 4L60, kind of in that, like, I call it like an intermediate / budget line. It's 3,000 to 3,200 RPM stall speed. It costs just about $500. Now you can get all kinds of converters for the 4L60, obviously, but I don't know how long I'm going to be sticking with the 4L60 platform, so I didn't want to spend like $1,000 on a really nice converter. And I think this one will work just fine. They say it's rated to like 500 horsepower, which will be under that for a while. But just like we're going to push the limits of the 4.8, I want to see what we can do with the 4L60. Yes, eventually we will be swapping to a 4L80, but who knows? Let's see what we can do with the 4L60 for now. But anyway, I did check the converter clearance. I've mentioned that to you guys 100 times. It's fairly important. Just take a straight edge, go across the bell housing there, measure to the bolt pad with it all the way in. That's about 1 inch for me. And then measure between the bolt pad here and the machine surface on the bell housing here, and that's 850 thousandths for me, which means 1/4 inch of pull out, or basically when you tighten the bolts, the converter pulls forward by 1/4 inch. It's a little bit more than required. I think they want somewhere right around 1/8 inch. And just like with the Circle D converter that I put in my 4L80, the Summit converter does come with its own hardware and a washer pack with 2 different thicknesses of washer. So we'll just select the appropriate one and give ourselves about 1/8 inch of pullout on that torque converter. Other than that, I did a few little tweaks just to make my life easier going in. I fought with the wiring harness when I pulled this thing out, but this time I removed the branch of the wiring that kind of goes across the firewall and down the frame. It has like 202 sensors, and then some of it comes up here for the mass air meter and the expansion tank for the low coolant level. But anyway, I just popped all those clips out because most of it was disconnected anyway, and that let me lay the whole harness that way, which will give me a ton of room. I don't have to fight with that. Also, I took the bumper off just because my cherry picker didn't have quite enough clearance to go in, so that'll make my life a little easier. It's like 6 bolts and the bumper comes right off. So anyway, this is it, guys. 4.8, it's going back in. Well, we got a couple of big items checked off the to-do list, and we're making progress on this project. The engine is in and all the major attachment points are torqued down. You know, the engine to the transmission, we have the motor mounts attached to the frame tightened down, and then finally we have the torque converter bolted up to the flex plate with the right spacer in. And that was kind of a pain in the butt just because there's not a lot of room to kind of get your fingers between the flex plate and the converter. On a 4L80, you can take that whole bottom cover off. There's plenty of space, but on a 4L60, there's just not a lot of room, but with the starter out, you can just kind of barely do it. Although if you do drop the washers down in the bottom, you might be taking the engine back apart because it would be really difficult to get it back out. But luckily we didn't drop anything, and we got Loctite on the bolts. It's all tightened down. So one major thing accomplished. I also did throw in the long tube header just to kind of get an idea of how it's going to fit in there. And so far it seems like it's going to fit pretty good. There is a pretty tight fit kind of right down there, if I can make that focus. Right down there, it's a pretty tight fit, although not too bad. I don't think it will hit. I am going to have to trim off a couple of those little studs that GM has on the bottom of the cab floor. They just kind of hold up like that aluminum heat shield thing. So I'll just trim those, but there'll be plenty of clearance other than that. And once I make sure both headers fit, I'm going to weld on a not a wideband. Well, I am going to put a bung for the wideband in one of them, but I'm going to weld on a pair of V-band flanges to make connection to the rest of the exhaust simple. I love V-bands. I use them wherever I can. But yeah, that's pretty much the major thing accomplished. We got the engine sitting in its home, and we do have a lot of stuff left to do. I mean, I've got to get I need to order some electric fans. I don't have those yet, but I'm just going to grab some used ones from the junkyard because factory ones tend to work best in my experience. We'll get the electric fan wiring done. We will rewire all of the factory stuff, just kind of reconnect everything. Wiring in the wideband sensor, we'll use that and plug it into the tuning software. Once we get the exhaust built, all the connections made, then it's a matter of getting the engine tuned. I'll be doing that. And then finally, after all of that, we'll get it back on the dyno and see how much power we gain, see if we're getting anywhere near what that 8.1 laid down at 306 horse and 426 pound-feet of torque. Once again, I don't really think we're going to get that much torque, but I think we'll get close to the horsepower and maybe exceed the 8.1 by maybe a little bit. We'll see. I'm excited to find out either way. I do want to say thank you guys for watching. I realize it's probably Thursday when this is going to go live, which means it's Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving, guys. Enjoy some turkey. And if you're anywhere from New England, enjoy a slice of blueberry pie because you can't get blueberries like you can up there where we are down here. But happy Thanksgiving, guys. Enjoy the time off. Enjoy your holiday. If you're working on Thanksgiving, thank you for your service. Appreciate it, guys. Please do me a favor, though, if you haven't already, drop a comment on this video. Let me know what you think of the 4.8 versus 8.1 shootout. Click the like button and let's see. Oh, subscribe. The important one. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I do appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. Have a happy holiday, and we'll see you soon.